dimensions. And finally, video games do too.
With the introduction of a three-dimensional space, we no longer had to mimic a virtual space.
The entire industry kind of got really excited.
But a world of 3 dimensions also brought controversy.
There's a seamy underbelly to the game business, just like the porno industry is to the movie industry.
They are doing exactly what culture makers are supposed to be doing. They're pissing people off. They're pushing the envelope. They're breaking the status quo.
The 2D games we played began to reflect the changing 3D world around us.
The market for military games, rather than dropping after 9/11, really started to get big.
How would you like it if somebody called you a lunatic?
First-person shooter games and flight simulators became the next generation's tools for defense.
It's not about the games, it's about the recruitment.
That's part of the world we're living in.
Presented by Best Buy, where this holiday, the wow's guaranteed.
In the last few decades, the video game has entered a new realm altogether. The third dimension.
The power of games is in their ability to immerse people in a different world.
The biggest change in video games has been the transition from 2D graphics to 3D graphics.
I think the ultimate goal, what we'd all like to see, would be the holodeck from Star Trek, where you have a fully realized environment. You're actually immersed in the thing.
In the 1980s, the 3D world was a rudimentary terrain of green lines called vectors. The first game to use this technology was Atari's Battlezone.
Every other game at the time was kind of like side-shuffling 2D game like Pac-Man, where you're just kind of moving and you looked from above the game, so to speak, kind of like looking at a mouse in a maze. This game, you were in the point of view of the person shooting.
In a lot of ways, it introduced the first-person shooter.
The game had many admirers, including the U.S. Army.
Delegates from the Army go to Atari saying, we're really into this Battlezone game. Could you create a prototype as a way to use this as an actual training device for a new kind of vehicle that eventually would become the Bradley Armored Infantry Vehicle?
It was perceived by the military as being important.
They recognized that what Battlezone was and what video games were was that they're not simply toys, that because they're models, the same model that is an entertainment can be modified and used to teach things.
This was the first in a long line of collaborations between the private game industry and the U.S. military.
Morning, soldier.
3D video game technology would take another leap forward thanks to George Lucas. The newly formed LucasArts produced a video game that allowed the first-person perspective to finally take flight.
And pilot your Valkyrie fighter through the craggy landscape of Fractalus.
Rescue on Fractalus, which hence the name, was one of the very first games to generate a 3D experience via fractals.
A fractal is a recursive algorithm, a mathematical equation found in nature. It was a way to give simple shapes the illusion of depth.
Explore every peak and valley, every canyon, searching for stranded space pilots, testing your skill against the dreaded Jaggies.
But Rescue on Fractalus was far more than a flying adventure, thanks to the insights of Lucas himself.
First time we showed this game to George Lucas, let him play the game, showed it to him. And he said, well, I really want a fire button. Was this a gameplay choice or was this a philosophical choice? It really wasn't gameplay, it was really philosophical. I really wanted to have a non-violent game. I don't want to have to shoot things in there. And he says, no, I want a fire button.
Mothership to Fox Slater, we are back in your sector.
In the dawn of the first-person shooter game, incredible advancements in computer technology would soon give way to brave new worlds. Although the use of fractals and vector graphics could not bring game designers' true visions to light, the 3D video game would take a giant leap forward in the 1990s, and it would be the PC that delivered it.
CPUs were at the point where they could actually draw enough stuff on the screen that the games looked interesting. We weren't bound to 2D anymore.
In the 90s, we got these new tools. We started to get processors, specialized processors that could do the floating point calculations of calculating what the light does in a world.
That allowed the rest of the industry to take some of the new power of PCs and contemplate creating more mature, grown-up game experiences.
The new processors allowed programmers enough computing power to create a true three-dimensional space. And no genre took advantage of the new technology in a more explosive way than the first-person shooter.
A first-person shooter game is any game where you are the character. You're looking out of the eyes of the character.
The shift from a third-person perspective to a first-person perspective, to have the horsepower to drive you, from a purely personal viewpoint, that was something I'd never experienced before.
All of a sudden, you're inside the game. When people are shooting at you, they're shooting at you. So it really changes the way that you approach the game. They were frightening.
The birth of the modern first-person shooter game occurs with Castle Wolfenstein 3D.
Is there anything more fun than blowing away Nazis with a Gatling gun? Maybe, but it's pretty fun.
The minds behind the fastest, bloodiest bullet fest of the day were John Romero and John Carmack, two programmers who worked together at a company called SoftDisk in Louisiana.
These guys all happened to be working there, and they met and they realized they were gamers, and principally it was John Romero. He was outspoken and he was funny and he was brash. And then there was John Carmack, who was a little more introspective.
What Carmack really was able to do was bring the speed to the game along with the high-quality graphics and make it just move so fast that there really was nothing like it that had come before.
We couldn't do everything we wanted to do in Wolfenstein. Graphically, the engine was limited, but we were sacrificing, this great view for speed.
But Wolfenstein 3D had pioneered a new style of gameplay. And what it lacked visually, it made up for with an unmistakable musical score.
This caused some controversy at the time in Germany because, of course, representations of the Third Reich have different levels of being forbidden in West Germany. So this game was banned because it used the Horst Wessel theme, which is a kind of Nazi anthem.
We got listed on the evil list in Germany. They're not allowed to show the Nazi symbol, the Iron Eagle, like all that stuff. In their country, they can't have that, and they don't want to show violence. They don't want to stir everybody up.
Wolfenstein 3D was as controversial as it was popular. But it didn't take long for the creators to come out with an even gore, with an edgier look at the first-person shooter games. They called it Doom. In 1993, a game called Doom would take the first-person shooter experience to a whole new level.
Doom started with a technology. The whole point of Doom was to make an engine that was way cooler than Wolfenstein, that had multi-level floors, multi-level ceilings, and light differences.
In Doom, you were a space marine who got sucked into hell and basically fought monsters and all kinds of occult enemies.
Not only did it have a higher frame rate than Wolfenstein 3D, it also gave players more weapons and better ways to dice up evil.
If they destroy somebody and he just falls down, that's kind of lame. If he blows into meat chunks and flies off the walls, that's okay as long as it's not too many meat chunks, I guess.
They wanted to make the games they wanted to play. And the games they wanted to play, they didn't even know what they were yet completely because no one had invented them. But they knew that they wanted something different than Mario.
The first-person shooter, something about the violence in it and about the sort of just unbelievable nastiness of it all actually is cathartic for these kids. That again, it speaks to them the way rock and roll spoke to their parents. It expresses for them something that they are not able to express in themselves, but they feel.
Teens of the 90s embraced this dark new genre wholeheartedly, spending almost as much money on video games as on movies.
Sort of like analogous to Nirvana and what Nirvana did in the music world. These early shooters and what was happening in the PC world in the early 90s had that kind of spirit and energy. It was a rebellious sort of a punk rock, you know, a heavy metal, this big growl from the underground that people had never heard before.
It was a dividing line. People on one side of the line did not get it. Not only didn't they get it, they thought it was bad, they thought it was leading to the demise of decent society.
You can look at Doom as the ultimate Generation X game. I mean, just think of the name itself, Doom. It's just got to be one of the most cynical concepts ever. You're going to die.
Personally, I'm not in favor of things that are tasteless in any medium. I think our society would be better off without it.
In 1993, Senator Joe Lieberman brought the debate over video game violence to a national level with a series of congressional hearings.
The real fear is that there are vulnerable children out there who will be personally affected by these games and begin to think about acting them out.
I hope you walk away with one thought today, that if you don't do something about it, we will.
The industry responded by launching the Entertainment Rating Software Board the following year.
So the idea is that this board came around and said, you know what, there's a need for this because parents need to understand, you know what, just because it's a video game doesn't mean little Jimmy should be playing it.
Even people who, you know, were old 60s civil rights activists think this game is horrible, instead of seeing it as this really incredible outpouring of expression. I mean, maybe it's violent, maybe it's angry, but maybe we need to pay attention to what that's telling us about our culture instead of assuming that it's some kind of evil thing.
Parents see some kid at his computer killing things over and over and over again without understanding the kind of mental game going on inside. It's just they see this physical representation of it and they freak out. They're like, it's training my kids to kill. Because there's also this kind of fear of the technology itself. They don't understand it and they're afraid of the fact they don't understand it.
Basically, video games are the new rock and roll. You know, it's the new bad thing for you. There'll be something else in the future that's bad for you that everyone can blame, you know, more deaths on.
Doom would not be the last shoot-'em-up game to cause a stir. In the years to come, as the genre pushed new technological boundaries, it would also push the envelope of decency and good taste. First-person shooter game has always been controversial, but as the genre continued to evolve, some titles seem to favor shock over awe.
Traffic released a game called JFK Reloaded, which was basically a simulation of the events surrounding the death of John F. Kennedy. And in this game, what we wanted to do was to try and create a unique opportunity for people to experience the assassination, but from the point of view of Lee Harvey Oswald.
The game makers studied the Warren Commission religiously, modeling the game for 10 months before releasing it online.
So we created a ballistics model that was as close as we could get to the accurate speed of that bullet, the wind that was moving, the speed of the car at that time of day. And we used all of these factors in order to create as close as possible a simulation to the actual events.
The purported role of the game was to teach you whether or not the Warren Commission was a correct representation of how it could have happened. But in reality, it's a game about shooting JFK.
The game had a popular following, but its run was cut short due to legal pressure from the Kennedy family.
There's a seamy underbelly to the game business, just like the porno industry is to the movie industry. And you can swim in that cesspool if you want to, and you don't have to if you don't want to.
Man, what these game developers won't do for a buck.
I'd have to say probably Postal 2 is probably the most shocking game I've played. I mean, you know, depends on how demented you are. If you're really demented, you'll like the game, you know? And if you're not, then you totally won't be into it.
There's something primal about Postal 2. There is something in all of us that wants to just get up in the morning and just go ballistic. And in many ways you would have to say, well, maybe games help relieve those feelings.
Despite all the controversy, first-person shooter games remained America's top sellers.
And certainly, I think they helped, quite frankly, sell PCs. And today we see companies now do very high-end PCs and laptops aimed specifically at a video gamer.
So it's really been a synergistic relationship between game design and technology that has advanced both of those sciences to where we are today.
First-person shooters put the player in the virtual world to simulate reality. But simulations were used in the art of war even before the PC existed. In 1929, Edwin Link constructed a machine that looked like a miniature aircraft, which could imitate a real plane's dips and dives. He called this flight simulator the Link Trainer.
Your early lessons will be in a nice, comfortable indoor gadget called a Link Trainer, which never leaves the ground.
At first, it was seen as a toy. But as the world armed itself for World War II, orders for Link simulators poured in from all over the world.
The world's armed forces have driven the technology for simulation, in many ways by necessity.
It's much more cost-effective to train a pilot on a simulator than on a real plane. And during World War II, they had to train a lot of pilots really quickly, so you see this kind of flight simulator technology being pushed forward at that time.
Though these early simulators were fairly primitive, Edwin Link had set the stage for what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry. The first program to deliver a 3D flying experience to the home computer was Microsoft's Flight Simulator series, launched in 1980.
When we look at it today, we can look and smile at the way it looked visually, but it certainly in those days was cutting-edge technology.
This software program puts you at the controls of the most realistic flight this side of FAA certification.
Back then it was 16 colors on the screen. I think there were 2 different airplanes you had to choose from, 5 scenery areas and about 80 airports. So it was quite limited compared to what it is today.
But as good as Microsoft's technology was for the time, it still lagged far behind what Uncle Sam was doing.
The leaders of graphical display technology in the 80s were really the military. They had things in the military with kind of 3D representation and kind of high-powered graphics that the rest of the world wouldn't see for another decade.
Unlike the Link Trainer, high-tech flight simulators were as close to the real thing as a fighter pilot could get without leaving the ground.
Nowadays, flight simulation and tank simulation technology are not simply the purview of America. This is something that is standard use in all the kind of advanced militaries around the world.
As the popularity of military simulation expanded around the globe, 3D technology would eventually meld with the first-person shooter genre, spurred on by a defining moment in history.
The market for military games, rather than dropping after 9/11, really started to get big.
In the next decade, video games continued to test the boundaries of both technology and content. The gamers of the 1990s would be enticed to join the establishment, as militaries around the world would lure a whole new generation of players into a simulated version of war. At the end of the 20th century, the first-person shooter had evolved into the world's most popular and controversial video game genre. Ironically, for all the debate, it was the government that needed it most.
In fall of 1999, the U.S. Army was missing its recruiting goals, and in fact missing them by quite a bit. And the Assistant Secretary of Army came up with the idea that we should maybe consider using the video game as a medium.
The U.S. government spent $7 million in seed money on a first-person shooter initiative designed to attract young recruits. But little did they know, the whole playing field was about to change.
9/11 had an impact on the game industry just the same way it had an impact on the world at large, is that what was normal wasn't normal anymore.
With America under attack, 9/11 brought a sense of urgency to the Army's first-person shooter project, which was already well underway at the Department of Defense. They called this new game America's Army.
Make a AAA video game that would give people an idea of what it was like to be in the Army.
Morning, soldier. Today's task is to qualify with the M16A2 rifle.
What the Army does is it takes sort of thoroughbred technologies like game engines and tools, and on top of that, it layers the Army.
The America's Army game was very much designed to be an accurate simulation of the way you train if you're in the Army.
In a normal game, you can fool around and shoot your buddies and do things like that. And if you do that in America's Army, you end up in the brig.
Ceasefire! Ceasefire!
Although the Army considered outsourcing the game, they eventually decided to produce it in-house.
What was significant about America's Army was that the Army just stepped up to the table and said, you know what, let's do this ourselves. And let's use this for recruitment, because there's a whole new generation of kids out there, and they've grown up on video games, and this is a way to reach them.
And they said, well, if we can build something that kids get exposed to when they're very young, then they will consider a career in the Army when they turn 18. And that's the entire premise of the America's Army game.
The Army realized they needed help marketing their wares to a traditionally cynical subculture of gamers.
We approached a firm in LA, Ignited Minds, and we asked them to help think about how do we market America's Army, thinking about how to connect this into popular culture.
America's Army was brought to E3, a popular video game convention held in Los Angeles each year. In May of 2002, the much-anticipated title was finally made public.
It was a big surprise. You know, we were front page of the LA Times, we were in the Game Show Daily, and I'd say within the first week on our website, it was getting maxed out on hits from kids interested in getting a copy.
America's Army was widely accepted among gamers for its gritty details. The fact that kids could download it and play one another over the internet for free made it even more enticing.
Once they realized it was a success, then they upped the quality, and they kept upping the quality. Till now, you go to GDC or E3, and the military has a huge presence there. Because it's not about the games, it's about the recruitment.
Some critics charge that America's Army went over the edge in recruiting young people through the use of a toy. After all, the same government that attacked the video game industry just a decade earlier was now attracting teens with a first-person shooter game of its own.
It's pretty funny that America's Army doesn't get a big backlash after all the Lieberman trials and everything that's happened in the media since Doom and all this stuff. It's all this violence in shooters, and then the Army goes and commissions a game about teaching people, you know, what it's like in the military to try and get new recruits in the military.
Violent games, mature certificate games shouldn't be sold to minors, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, we have America's Army, a free online game that effectively trains people how to become soldiers for the Iraq War. It's a kind of brainwashing for free, supplied by the American government.
We don't operate in a vacuum when we make things like America's Army. We operate in the world we live in. And what we put across is not the idea of war is good or bad. Those are national policy questions. What we put across is, here's what it is to be a soldier in an army.
Soldiers are soldiers. They're going over there to get shot at and shoot at other people. There's no point in pussyfooting around there, right? So let's prepare the guys.
Perhaps an even better example of what has been described as an advergame or militainment is Pandemic Studios' Full Spectrum Warrior.
Early 90, RPGs control the path of the checkpoint.
Full Spectrum Warrior, it's a simulator that simulates squad-based tactics.
Even though it's a third-person game, you're not actually playing as a character in the game. You are more or less giving commands, sort of like a real-time strategy game.
Unlike America's Army, the game was created out of a collaboration between a private gaming company and a government-sponsored think tank called the Institute for Creative Technologies.
ICT is USC's Institute for Creative Technologies. It's a university-affiliated research center funded by the U.S. Army.
The Institute, which opened in 1999 with a $45 million grant, was designed to bring the military to games and games to the military.
It was a way to create a center that would bring the best of entertainment, money from the military, and create products that could be used for both sectors.
Although Full Spectrum Warrior was eventually released as a commercial title, it was originally made as a tactical trainer for U.S. Army infantry.
The soldier of the 21st century has to know a lot more than just his weapon. He has to know all the systems that he's integrated with, how he talks to the UAVs and the remote drones. It's a much more complicated system that he's part of now.
In Fort Benning, Georgia, at the Close Combat Tactical Training Facility, soldiers now train in advanced simulators before facing the real battlefront.
Well, what we do here is we bring in crews and we put them in these virtual reality simulators, and then they go through combat operations, a tactical combat operations in this facility, much like they would actually do it in a real war.
Move out, give me a steady platform.
But the U.S. isn't the only nation using video games to train soldiers. Military simulation is now a worldwide phenomenon. The possibility still remains that the gamers of today will be fighting the wars of tomorrow in the virtual arena. Around the world, first-person shooter games are being used to train soldiers for combat.
Most countries' budget, military budget relative to the U.S. is considerably less, so they don't really even have the resources to run actual boots-on-the-ground training like we do. So they do almost all of their training virtually.
If a country can afford a $10 million or $20 million plane, they can afford a $3,000 PCU with a flight simulator.
Virtual war training is utilized throughout Europe, Australia, and Southeast Asia. Companies like ITSA, the International Training and Simulation Alliance, actually work to link networks together to simulate larger conflicts around the world. For example, the U.S. Army has engaged in war simulations multiple times with Taiwan. Other countries, such as Singapore and Indonesia, engage in mock war exercises as well.
Range, 675. Driver up, fire.
Today, when we're trying to prepare our kids for increasingly virtual wars, it's not coincidence that they're going to end up playing video games. You know, this is the way wars will be fought in the future.
And so the future of war is the interfaces and weapon systems going to look like games. It's going to have joysticks. It's going to all be electronic. In fact, we're probably halfway there in the military right now.
These kids have grown up for 18 years with this controller in their hands. How can we get our tanks to be controlled with this similar controller? How can we get communication systems to be controlled in that way? They're trying to leverage basically the skills that players have learned over the years of growing up playing video games.
This new technology is undeniably potent, but people disagree on its best application.
There are great benefits in simulating war. Obviously, if you prepare for worst-case scenarios beforehand, you're better prepared. The danger, however, is if the simulations get too good, that you begin to mistake the representation for the real thing.
Not only has there been a plethora of games designed by militaries post 9/11, but the private sector is creating its own games as well.
They actually give a pretty comforting view of terrorism, because in these kind of Tom Clancy games and stuff, there's a clear enemy, there's a clear goal in taking him out, and when you take him out, that will stop a certain event from happening.
The countries that are the most critical of America's foreign policy are creating the American soldier hero, and it's American companies that are creating the revisionist American soldier who, you know, we're not really sure if he's a hero or an anti-hero or a good guy or a bad guy or what he's even fighting for.
I used to hunt terrorists. Now I am one.
Companies like Kuma Games, an ad-sponsored internet site, actually capitalize on real-world conflicts as they happen.
As something happens in the war in Iraq or in the war in Afghanistan, immediately the coders start working on replicating that event or that battle, and then within a month you can be playing it on your screen.
The company even simulates conflicts that have yet to happen, as with their controversial series, Assault on Iran.
President Bush came on the air and he said, all options are on the table, you know, with regards to Iran. And then the Iranian president came on, he said, the United States cannot, you know, invade us, that we're not another Iraq.
Kuma capitalized on the controversy by creating a scenario in which a U.S. strike team was sent into Iran to take out a nuclear target. In response, a group calling itself the Union of Islamic Student Societies designed a title of their own, in which gamers can play from the opposite perspective.
The comments that we've gotten from Iranians have been all across the board. They're at a crossroads, you know, as a nation. And so we become, to a certain extent, a lightning rod. People can, in fact, come to us and talk about it, but that they're not really talking about the game.
That's a really interesting interactive experience to have, assuming that those experiences are designed and developed from a place of accuracy and a place of genuinely trying to promote knowledge and learning versus just sort of being, you know, exploitive.
As with many of today's warfare-themed games, Kuma relies on an army of military advisors to get it right.
There's been this kind of accidental relationship between using games for strategy and warfare and using games for entertainment, where some kind of development in one sphere kind of accidentally or by a side effect affected the other sphere. What's happened very recently, like let's say in the last decade, is that what had been an accidental or side effect relationship between these two worlds is now very much a planned collaboration between these worlds.
As further evidence of that growing relationship between the video game industry and the military, in March of 2003, as the U.S. invaded Iraq, Sony Corporation filed a trademark application for the U.S. military's catchphrase, shock and awe, apparently for use as a future PlayStation title.
But I think it's crass to exploit war in video game terms, and I think shock and awe was an example of that, because I think that people saw through that. And again, I think that gamers and people who grew up on them and this media-savvy generation can distinguish between the two.
3D video game technology and first-person shooters have become synonymous with American military training, modeling, and recruitment. But cultures everywhere also had access.
If games are like our military training systems and they become available to everyone, what does it mean that that knowledge has now become democratized?
In 2002, a Syrian company, Afkar Media, developed a game called Under Siege, where players reenact the First Intifada from the Palestinian perspective.
Their argument being that, you know, a lot of Arab youth love playing video games, but they hate the fact that they have to play Americans fighting Arabs as the enemy.
Some sociologists fear these games are contributing to an increasingly hostile world.
I think when you look at the entire construct of the world that we live in, especially the world that's impacted by video games, and when you talk about war, it seems like it depersonalizes war, dehumanizes war. Because you stand there and look at CNN, and you see images of the destruction that you also can see in your video game simulations.
And those images they put of, like, you know, the targets and the airplanes bombing it, that is kind of dangerous. I mean, the fact that someone, especially if he's young and he didn't see much, start looking at the real world, and the real war as a virtual war, is kind of disturbing.
For many reasons, war has become like a video game. But there's a basic way in which war is not a video game, in that one of the huge appeals of video game is actions without consequence. And that's where people begin to feel uneasy with things like America's Army, where it's drawing you in with this idea of no consequence to your actions, when in reality, war has the ultimate consequence, which is the death of other human beings and the death of yourself, perhaps.
This is real war. Real war is not only the adventure, it's not only the fun of going on a stakeout in the middle of the night, it's also seeing your friend dying in your hands. When this blends in with video games or virtual reality, it's disturbing because you go to war without realizing that people can die and that you can do some very harmful things to civilians.
When I look around and I see so many military games or military-themed games or games that are teaching skills that would be helpful to the military, I have to wonder, are we moving to a more militarized culture? But then when people ask, are games good or bad for you, you have to say, well, do you want to live in an increasingly militarized culture? Some people do.
6-6, we copy that.
The explosion of 3D technology wouldn't have happened without the armed forces. In turn, the military has benefited immensely from the first-person shooter genre. And as this tango goes on, the future of war may look more like a video game than anyone ever imagined. As 3D video game technology evolved, the immersive world of games has moved beyond the virtual and crossed over into real-world military applications. So where will the next evolution take us?
It's kind of like this ideological escalation through game technology, and it just makes you wonder, isn't there a better way to use this?
Bucking the current trend, Sweden is actually attempting to use first-person shooter technology to ease tensions through their game Foreign Ground. Paid for by the Swedish Department of Defense, this international peacekeeping game teaches soldiers soft skills like negotiation, rather than just relying on combat skills.
People always ask me, why do games, have so many guns and so much violence? And it's because a gun is just such a visceral way for interactivity, for instant interaction. Foreign Ground is more, I would say, more of a training simulator than a video game.
Americans are also starting to find potential in the medium, beyond the obvious military applications.
The same groups that went and learned a lot about, game technology and building America's Army are now doing research of how to use games and virtual worlds to do post-traumatic stress treatment and a lot of other very important things.
Dr. Albert Skip Rizzo, director of the Virtual Environments Lab at USC Los Angeles, is leading the way in this relatively new field.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a response to extreme trauma. It's anything where somebody is traumatized beyond the realm of normal human experience.
Dr. Rizzo uses virtual reality exposure sessions to help military veterans overcome post-traumatic stress.
In the course of say 10 or 12 sessions of exposure therapy, you would gradually ask the person to re-expose themselves either in imagination or in virtual reality, and eventually they get used to it.
Only the therapist is able to control the intensity of the experience.
Start off at the very lowest level of exposure. They start off very gradually at a level that the person can handle. Only once the person has adjusted to the very basic exposure environment, then you add in perhaps the sound of a bomb.
First designed to help Vietnam War veterans, this technology is now a useful tool for overcoming many types of traumatic experiences.
People have applied it for the World Trade Center experience. They've applied it for motor vehicle accidents, for other combat situations in Europe.
Psychologists are not the only ones attempting to make the world a better place. A company called Games for Change is also utilizing the technology in innovative ways.
Generally, what it means is that games can be used for purposes other than just entertainment.
Asi Borak, a former intelligence officer in the Israeli army, and his partner Eric Brown have created a video game that strives to find peace in the Middle East.
Peacemaker is a strategy simulation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The most important thing is that you play as either perspective, as the Palestinian president or the Israeli prime minister.
It's a simulation game. We did something very restricted in the sense that you can do what a leader can do, and you can play both sides.
As world politics enter a new phase in the post-9/11 era, so do the politics of video games.
You know, we live in a world that seems to be getting increasingly dangerous, increasingly nationalistic, increasingly let's stay isolated from each other. And fortunately, all the technologies are coming to actually allow us to reach beyond those boundaries and actually connect to other people.
There's no doubt video game technology is becoming an integral part of our world. But will it be our downfall or our salvation?
Gee, I can use this pen to write something which is going to save millions of lives. I could use this pen to write something which is going to send millions of people to their deaths. Oh my God, the pen has the power. It has nothing to do with the pen. It has nothing to do with the computer game. All of these things are enablers, they're levers, they're tools for our own human brains. It's just us. We can't, no matter how much we would like to, slough off any of the responsibility of our own decisions onto our artifacts and say they made the decisions.